The pale blue fingers of the Ezrathi female trembled as she polished the gleaming floor of Commander Dravik's private chambers. Minji had been working since before the artificial dawn cycle began on the Grudian warship. Her thin legs ached from kneeling for hours, but she dared not stop. The commander would return soon, and everything needed to be perfect. Minji belonged to the delicate Ezrathi species, slender humanoids with translucent blue skin that revealed the gentle pulse of their twin hearts. Her people were known across the galaxy for their gentle nature and remarkable intuition with living systems. These qualities made them excellent healers and cultivators, but to the Grudian Empire, they were simply exotic servants worth displaying as status symbols. Commander Dravik was among the highest-ranking officers in the Grudian fleet. His scaled face and imposing 7-foot frame struck fear into enemies and subordinates alike. He collected rare objects from conquered worlds, and 3 years ago, he had added Minji to his collection after a raid on her homeworld. The door hissed open, and Minji quickly lowered her gaze to the floor as heavy footsteps entered the room. The commander was not alone. "As you can see, Admiral, my quarters reflect the standards I expect throughout my command," Dravik said, his gravelly voice echoing against the metal walls. "Even my personal slave maintains absolute order." Minji kept her head down as the two officers walked around her. She had learned that invisibility was her best protection. "Impressive," the Admiral replied. "The High Command has been pleased with your efficiency. That's why you're being considered for the Sector 7 assignment." Minji's heart raced. Sector 7 was far from charted space. If the commander received this assignment, she might never see another Ezrathi again. "The bioweapon initiative requires absolute secrecy," the Admiral continued, lowering his voice. "Your experience with biological warfare makes you ideally suited." The officers moved toward Dravik's strategy table, their conversation turning to military matters. Minji continued her work, carefully backing away to clean another section. As she moved, her foot slipped on the freshly polished surface. She stumbled, desperately trying to regain her balance. In her panic, Minji knocked over a pedestal holding one of the commander's prized possessions, a crystalline artifact from a conquered world. It crashed to the floor, shattering into countless glittering fragments. The room fell silent. Minji froze, terror consuming her. "You worthless creature!" Dravik roared, crossing the room in 3 massive strides. His scaled hand closed around her throat, lifting her until her feet dangled above the floor. That artifact was irreplaceable. "I apologize, Commander," the Admiral said stiffly. "I'll leave you to address this incident." After the Admiral departed, Dravik threw Minji against the wall. The impact sent sharp pain through her body. She crumpled to the floor, trying to make herself as small as possible. "Clean this mess," he snarled. "I'll decide your punishment later." For hours, Minji carefully gathered every shard of the broken artifact, her hands bleeding from the sharp edges. When Dravik returned, his rage had cooled into something more calculated and dangerous. "Your clumsiness has cost me more than an artifact," he said. The Admiral was not impressed by the lack of discipline in my quarters. Minji kept her eyes on the floor. "This one begs forgiveness, Master." "Your continued presence offends me," Dravik replied coldly. "Tomorrow we dock at Terra Station for supplies before departing to Sector 7. You will not be joining us." Minji's heart hammered against her ribs. Being abandoned was essentially a death sentence. The next morning, 2 Grudian guards escorted Minji through the connecting docks between the warship and Terra Station. Her few possessions were contained in a small cloth bag. One of the guards handed her a document and shoved her forward. "Commander Dravik has officially relinquished ownership," the guard grunted. "You're no one's problem now." Terra Station buzzed with activity. Humans of various sizes and colors moved purposefully through the main concourse, mixing with a dozen alien species. Minji had never seen so many different beings in one place. The noise and movement overwhelmed her senses. She clutched her document, uncertain what to do. Without a master or purpose, she had no right to be anywhere. The station's artificial lighting seemed too bright, the recycled air too thin. A group of uniformed humans approached, and Minji quickly stepped into a side corridor to avoid them. She needed to find somewhere quiet to think. The further she moved from the main areas, the emptier the corridors became. Eventually, she found herself in what appeared to be a maintenance section. Pipes ran along the ceiling, carrying the station's lifeblood of water, air, and power. Minji slid down against a wall, her legs finally giving out. The fall yesterday had injured her more than she realized. Her right ankle was swollen, and pain shot up her leg whenever she put weight on it. She opened her bag and took inventory of her meager possessions: a spare tunic, a small knife she'd hidden from the commander, a water container, and a handful of nutrient bars she'd managed to save from her rations. Maybe enough food for 3 days if she was careful. The document from Dravik was written in Grudian script, which she could barely read. From what she understood, it stated she was no longer claimed property but offered no guidance on what she was supposed to do now. As the station's lighting dimmed to simulate evening, Minji explored further into the maintenance tunnels. She found a small junction room with enough space to create a temporary shelter behind some equipment. It was warm here, with the hum of machinery providing constant background noise. Minji curled into a ball, trying to ignore the throbbing pain in her ankle. Tears silently tracked down her blue cheeks. On her homeworld, her people lived in communal groups, always surrounded by family and friends. She had never been truly alone until now. She thought about the humans who populated this station. She had heard stories about them, how they had abolished slavery within their territories, but maintained complicated diplomatic relations with empires like the Grudians. Would they help her if they found her? Or would they return her to the Grudians to avoid conflict? Minji didn't know the answer, and she wasn't ready to risk finding out. For now, she would hide, heal, and plan. She would survive. She had to. 3 days had passed since Minji had hidden herself in the maintenance tunnels of Terra Station. Her food supplies were nearly gone, and the pain in her ankle had not improved. She had fashioned a crude bandage from strips of her spare tunic, but without proper medical attention, she feared the injury might be permanent. The station's rhythms became familiar to her. She learned when the maintenance workers were most likely to appear and kept to the shadows during those times. At night, when activity slowed, she ventured out to explore nearby sections and search for anything useful. Water was her most pressing concern. Her small container had emptied quickly, and thirst was becoming unbearable. She had discovered a leaking pipe 2 corridors away from her hiding spot, but the drops came slowly, barely enough to wet her tongue. On this particular morning, Minji was awakened by the sound of an alarm blaring through the station. Red emergency lights flashed in the corridor outside her junction room. She pressed herself deeper into her hiding place, unsure what was happening. The station's announcement system echoed through the tunnels. Attention all personnel. Environmental control system malfunction detected in Section 12B. Technicians report to your stations. This is not a drill. Minji's heart raced. Section 12B was where she had been hiding. The junction room contained important environmental regulators, she realized. Soon, workers would come to investigate the problem. She gathered her few possessions and prepared to flee, but a sudden wave of dizziness forced her back down. The lack of food and water had weakened her more than she had thought. Within minutes, she heard footsteps approaching. Minji tucked herself behind the largest regulator unit, making herself as small as possible. The junction room door slid open with a mechanical hiss. System shows the primary thermal regulator is overheating. A human voice said, "We need to get it stabilized before it affects life support for the whole section." Taho Kim wiped sweat from his forehead as he entered the junction room. At 28, he was Terra Station's youngest senior environmental engineer. His dark hair was messily pushed back, and his uniform bore the patches and stains of someone who worked with their hands. He moved directly to the main control panel, his fingers dancing across the interface. Temperatures spiking in the coolant system. I need to check the manual overrides. Taho crouched down and slid open an access panel near the floor. As he reached inside to adjust the controls, a strange sound caught his attention. Something like a gasp. He paused, listening carefully. "Hello," he called. "Is someone in here?" Silence answered him. Shrugging, he returned to his work, but as he shifted position, his light illuminated a small space behind the regulator unit. Something blue reflected the light. Tahoe slowly moved his light back to that spot. This time, he clearly saw what appeared to be a blue-skinned hand quickly withdrawing into the shadows. "I can see you," he said calmly. "I'm not going to hurt you. Please come out." After a long moment, Minji slowly emerged from behind the regulator. Her blue skin was dulled with dirt, her clothes torn and stained. She looked terrified, her large eyes darting toward the exit. Tahoe stared in surprise. "You're Azrathi, aren't you?" He had seen members of her species before, though rarely. "What are you doing hiding in a junction room?" Minji didn't answer. She stood awkwardly, favoring her injured leg. "You're hurt," Tahoe said, noticing her swollen ankle. He reached for his communicator, but Minji made a small, frightened sound and tried to back away. "Wait, please," Tahoe said, lowering his communicator. "I just want to help. Are you a passenger? Did you get separated from your group?" Minji shook her head. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was barely audible. "No group. No purpose now." Tahoe's brow furrowed in confusion. Then understanding dawned on his face as he noticed how she held herself. Head down, shoulders hunched, the posture of someone accustomed to taking orders. "Were you someone's property?" he asked carefully. Minji nodded slightly. "Commander Dravik, Grudian military. He left me here 3 days ago. I am useless now." She gestured toward her injured leg. Anger flashed across Tahoe's face. The Grudians were known for their continued practice of slavery despite galactic pressure to end it. Human territories like Terra Station had outlawed the practice centuries ago, but complicated diplomatic agreements meant they often had to look the other way when Grudian ships docked. "You're not useless," Tahoe said firmly. "And you're not property. Not here." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a ration bar. "Here, you must be hungry." Minji hesitated, then carefully accepted the food. She ate slowly, as if savoring each bite. While she ate, Tahoe quickly finished the repairs to the regulator. The alarm stopped, and the emergency lights returned to normal. "My name is Tahoe," he said when she had finished eating. "What's yours?" "Minji," she answered, her voice a little stronger now. "Minji, I need to report this to station security," Tahoe explained. "The Grudians can't just abandon people here." Fear flashed across her face. "They will send me back." Tahoe shook his head firmly. "No, they won't. Terra Station follows human law. You have rights here." He paused, thinking. "But before we go to security, let's get that ankle looked at. I have a friend in medical who can help without asking too many questions." Minji looked uncertain. "Why would you help me?" "Because it's the right thing to do," Tahoe said simply. He stood and offered his hand. "Can you walk?" Minji tried to stand but winced in pain. Without hesitation, Tahoe moved to support her, letting her lean against him. "We'll take the service corridors," he said. "Fewer people that way." As they made their slow way through the maintenance tunnels, Tahoe spoke quietly about the station, explaining how things worked. Minji listened intently, her eyes taking in every detail. "The station director is Dr. Juu Park," Tahoe explained. "She's fair and believes strongly in human rights extending to all sentient beings. She'll help us figure out your situation." "What if Grudians come back?" Minji asked. "Then we'll deal with that when it happens," Tahoe replied. "For now, let's focus on getting you healthy and safe." They paused at a junction, checking that the corridor was clear before continuing. Minji's breathing was labored from the effort of walking, but determination showed in her eyes. "On my world," she said softly, "we believe that kindness to strangers brings good fortune." Tahoe smiled. On mine too, actually. As they approached the medical section, Minji stopped suddenly. Thank you, she said, looking directly at Tahoe for the first time. I thought I would die alone in those tunnels. You're not alone anymore, Tahoe replied. And from now on, you decide your own purpose. He pressed the access panel, and the medical bay door slid open to reveal a bright, clean room beyond, the first step into Minji's new life. The medical bay's bright lights made Minji squint after days spent in the dim maintenance tunnels. Dr. Hannah examined her ankle with gentle hands, her kind eyes occasionally glancing up at the nervous Ezrathi. The ligaments are strained, but not torn, she explained to both Minji and Tahoe. With proper treatment and rest, it should heal completely within a few weeks. Minji watched in fascination as the doctor applied a cooling gel to her swollen ankle before wrapping it in a special bandage that hardened slightly, providing support while still allowing movement. This will help with the pain and swelling, Dr. Hannah said, handing Minji a small container of pills, one every 6 hours, and drink plenty of water. After finishing the treatment, Dr. Hannah stepped away to speak quietly with Tahoe. Minji could tell they were discussing her situation by their concerned glances in her direction. Eventually, Tahoe returned to her side. Dr. Hannah has agreed to keep your presence quiet for now, he explained. But we need to inform Station Director Park soon. There are protocols for situations like yours. Minji's eyes widened with fear. The Grudians won't be allowed to reclaim you, Tahoe assured her. But we need to establish your legal status properly. That night, Minji slept in a small storage room connected to Tahoe's quarters. It was the first time in days she had slept on something other than a hard floor. The simple cot felt like luxury after her time in the tunnels. The next morning, Tahoe brought her fresh clothes, a standard station jumpsuit that was too large but clean, and a proper meal of synthesized protein and vegetables. Minji ate slowly, savoring each bite. Director Park has agreed to meet with us privately this afternoon, Tahoe said as they finished breakfast. She's dealt with refugee cases before. Minji nervously smoothed the oversized jumpsuit. What should I say? Just tell her the truth, Tahoe replied. Director Park is fair. She'll help. Director Ju Park's office overlooked the main atrium of Terra Station. Through the large viewport, Minji could see humans and aliens moving about their daily business far below. The director was a tall woman with silver-streaked black hair pulled back in a neat bun. Her expression was serious but kind. Miss Minji, Director Park began after introductions were complete. Your situation is unfortunately not unique. The Grudian Empire's practices conflict with our laws, creating difficult diplomatic situations. She tapped her screen, bringing up a document. According to our treaty with the Grudian Empire, once an owner formally relinquishes claim to property, even sentient property, that being is no longer under Grudian protection or law. So she's free? Tahoe asked hopefully. Yes and no, Director Park replied. She's no longer Grudian property, but she doesn't automatically have human citizenship or protection either. She exists in a legal gray area. Minji's heart sank. What happens to me? We can offer you temporary refugee status while we process an application for permanent residency, Director Park explained. You'll need a sponsor and a means of contributing to the station. I'll sponsor her, Tahoe said immediately. Director Park nodded, seemingly unsurprised. And as for contribution? Minji hesitated. On my world, I was trained to be a plant tender before the Grudians came. I know how to make things grow. Director Park's expression brightened slightly. Our hydroponics bay has been struggling since we lost our specialist to Proxima Colony. Perhaps you could assist there. 2 weeks later, Minji stood in Terra Station's vast hydroponics bay. The space stretched over an entire level, filled with growing plants of various species. Automated systems controlled light, water, and nutrients, but the plants were failing to thrive. Many showed signs of disease or nutrient deficiency. Tahoe watched as Minji moved carefully through the rows, her injured ankle much improved, but still causing a slight limp. She touched leaves, smelled soil, and examined roots with a level of attention that surprised him. "These plants are lonely," she said finally. Tahoe looked confused. "Lonely? They're plants." Minji smiled slightly. "On my world, we understand that all living things need connection. These plants grow in isolation, each in its separate container. On Azrath, we plant companions, species that help each other." She pointed to a struggling tomato plant. "This one needs basil nearby. They strengthen each other. Our last specialist insisted on keeping species separate to prevent cross-contamination," Tahoe explained. "That works for machines, not living things," Minji replied with unexpected confidence. "May I make some changes?" Over the next several days, Minji reorganized the hydroponics bay. She created mixed growing beds, pairing complementary species. She adjusted the light cycles to better match natural conditions and introduced beneficial insects to pollinate flowers and control pests. The hydroponics staff were skeptical at first, but Minji's quiet determination eventually won them over. Her knowledge seemed instinctive rather than learned, an innate understanding of how living systems work together. A month after her arrival on Terra Station, the hydroponics bay was transformed. Vegetables and fruits grew in abundance, healthier and more productive than before. The air in the bay was fresher, filled with the scent of growing things. Director Park visited to see the changes for herself. She walked slowly through the lush greenery, nodding with approval. "Impressive work, Minji," she said. "Production is up 40% according to the latest reports." Minji ducked her head modestly. "The plants do the work. I just listen to what they need." "Nevertheless, your contributions have been valuable." Director Park handed Minji a small data card. "Your permanent residency application has been approved. You're officially a resident of Terra Station, with all the protections that status provides." Minji's blue fingers trembled as she accepted the card. "Thank you, Director." That evening, Tahoe took Minji to the station's observation deck to celebrate. Through the massive viewport, the stars stretched endlessly against the darkness of space. Minji pressed her hand against the transparent barrier, her eyes reflecting the distant lights. "I never saw the stars while serving Commander Dravik," she said softly. "We weren't allowed in viewing areas." Tahoe stood beside her, watching her face rather than the stars. "What will you do now that you're officially free?" Minji considered the question. Her ankle had healed, though she would always have a slight limp. Her work in hydroponics had given her purpose and respect. For the first time since her capture, she could make her own choices. "I want to learn," she said finally, "about human ways, about science, about growing food in space, and someday I want to help others like me." "Others? There are many slaves in the Grudian Empire," Minji explained. "Not just Azrathi. If I could show them that another life is possible." Tahoe nodded slowly. "One step at a time. First, we celebrate your freedom." As they turned to leave, an alert sounded throughout the station. The overhead announcement system activated with a message that made Minji freeze in place. "Attention all personnel. Grudian diplomatic vessel requesting emergency docking. All section chiefs report to briefing room immediately." Tahoe looked at Minji's suddenly pale face. "It's probably nothing to do with you," he said, not sounding convinced. Minji's hands trembled. "It's Commander Dravik. I can feel it." Minji stood in Director Park's office, her slender blue fingers twisting together nervously. Tahoe stood beside her, a reassuring presence as they waited for news about the Grudian ship. When the doors slid open, Director Park entered with a grim expression. "It is Commander Dravik," she confirmed, sitting behind her desk. "His ship has requested emergency docking for repairs. Under our treaties, we can't refuse." Minji's twin hearts raced with fear. "He will find me." "You're a legal resident now," Tahoe reminded her. "He has no claim on you." Director Park nodded. "Technically correct, but Grudians don't always respect our laws when they conflict with their interests." She looked directly at Minji. I think it would be best if you remain in secured areas until they leave, perhaps the inner hydroponics section. For how long? Tahoe asked. Their repairs should take no more than 3 days, Director Park replied. After that, they'll be gone. Minji agreed to the plan, but a sense of dread followed her as she returned to work. The hydroponics bay became both sanctuary and prison as she avoided public areas of the station. The days passed in anxious waiting, with Tahoe bringing updates along with her meals. On the second day, Tahoe arrived at the hydroponics bay with worry etched across his face. Commander Dravik has been asking questions, he said quietly. He's specifically inquired about any Azrathi on the station. Minji's hand trembled as she adjusted the nutrient flow to a row of plants. What did Director Park tell him? That all resident species information is private, Tahoe said. But he's persistent. He claims he's looking for stolen property. That night, Minji could barely sleep. Her dreams were filled with memories of Commander Dravik's cruelty. She woke early and went to check on a batch of seedlings that needed special care. The therapeutic rhythm of tending plants calmed her nerves. The hydroponics bay door slid open, and Minji looked up expecting to see Tahoe. Instead, the massive scaled form of Commander Dravik filled the doorway. Minji froze, her breath caught in her throat. The commander's yellow eyes widened in recognition, his mouth twisting into what passed for a smile among Grudians. There you are, he said, his gravelly voice exactly as she remembered. My wayward property. Minji backed away, knocking over a tray of seedlings. I am not your property anymore. Commander Dravik stepped into the room, towering over her. A legal technicality. You were expensive to acquire and train. I was hasty in discarding you. You abandoned me, Minji said, surprising herself with her boldness. And now I've returned, Dravik replied smoothly. Gather your things. You're coming with me when repairs are complete. Minji straightened her back, though her limbs trembled. No, I am a resident of Terra Station now. I have rights here. Dravik's expression darkened. Human concepts don't apply to you. You are Azrathi, born to serve superior species. The door slid open again, and Tahoe entered. He assessed the situation quickly, stepping between Minji and the commander. Commander Dravik, you're in a restricted area, he said firmly. Visitors must have authorization to enter hydroponics. Dravik barely glanced at him. I'm retrieving my property, human. This doesn't concern you. Minji is a legal resident of Terra Station, Tahoe replied. She has documentation. You formally relinquished any claim to her when you abandoned her here. The commander's scaled hand moved to the weapon at his belt. This creature possesses information vital to Grudian security. Her return is a matter of imperial interest. What information? Minji asked, confused. She had never been privy to anything important while serving the commander. Your biological knowledge, Dravik said. Your instinctive understanding of growth patterns and cellular structures. His voice lowered. Our scientists have been trying to develop certain biological agents. Your skills would be valuable. Understanding dawned on Minji's face. You want me for a weapons program. The Azrathi connection to living systems is unique, Dravik admitted. We've been trying to replicate it with limited success. Tahoe looked disgusted. You're talking about biological warfare. The commander shrugged his massive shoulders. I'm talking about imperial security. Now stand aside. No, Tahoe said firmly. Any claim you want to make needs to go through proper channels. Director Park has been notified of your presence here. As if summoned by her name, Director Park's voice came over the station's communication system. Commander Dravik, please report to the main administrative office immediately. Dravik's eyes narrowed. This isn't finished. He turned and stalked out of the hydroponics bay. Minji collapsed against a planting table, her legs weak with relief and fear. He won't give up. Director Park won't let him take you, Tahoe assured her, though uncertainty tinged his voice. but I don't like this talk of biological weapons." An hour later, they sat in Director Park's office as she explained the diplomatic situation. "Commander Dravik has filed a formal request for your return," she told Minji. "He claims you possess classified Grudian military information and that your retention here violates Section 12 of our Mutual Security Treaty." "That's ridiculous," Tahoe protested. She was a household slave, not a military asset. Director Park held up a hand. "I agree, but we need to handle this carefully. The Grudians are suggesting that our refusal could be interpreted as an act of espionage." "What will happen?" Minji asked quietly. "I've contacted Earth Central Command," Director Park replied. "They're sending a legal team, but they won't arrive for at least a week. In the meantime, Commander Dravik has agreed not to attempt to remove you by force while negotiations continue." "And if negotiations fail?" Tahoe asked. Director Park's expression was grave. "Let's hope they don't." Over the next 2 days, Commander Dravik remained on the station, his presence a constant shadow over Minji's thoughts. His ship's repairs were completed, but he showed no sign of departing. Minji continued her work in hydroponics, but now she worked with new purpose. Each evening, she took samples from various plants back to the small laboratory attached to the growing area. Tahoe helped her access scientific databases, watching curiously as she conducted experiments. "What exactly are you doing?" he finally asked, as she carefully extracted a clear liquid from a modified alga culture. Minji looked up, determination in her eyes. "The commander wants me for my knowledge of biological systems. I'm using that knowledge, but not how he intended." "I don't understand." "Grudians have a unique respiratory system," Minji explained. "Their scaled skin absorbs certain compounds directly into their bloodstream. It's an evolutionary adaptation from their homeworld." She held up the vial of clear liquid. "This compound is harmless to humans and most other species, but to Grudians..." She paused. "It will temporarily paralyze their voluntary muscles without causing permanent harm." Tahoe stared at her in amazement. "You're creating a defense against them." Minji nodded. "If Commander Dravik tries to take me by force, we'll be ready. And we'll have proof of their bioweapon program to show Earth Central," Tahoe added, understanding dawning on his face. "Yes," Minji said quietly. "Sometimes what makes you valuable to the wrong people can help you fight against them." 3 days had passed since Minji had revealed her plan to Tahoe. The tension on Terra Station had grown steadily as Commander Dravik's patience wore thin. His scaled face appeared more frequently in public areas, his yellow eyes scanning crowds for any sign of the Azrathi woman he considered his property. Director Park had arranged for enhanced security around the hydroponics bay, but everyone knew this was only a temporary solution. Earth Central's legal team was still 4 days away, and Dravik's demands were becoming more aggressive. Minji worked tirelessly in the small laboratory, perfecting her compound. Her blue fingers moved with surprising confidence among the equipment as Tahoe watched in admiration. "It's ready," she announced finally, holding up a small container of clear liquid. "I've tested it on cellular samples. It will work." Tahoe looked concerned. "How do we use it? We can't just walk up to Dravik and splash him with it." "Grudians absorb it through their skin," Minji explained. "We need to get it into the air around them." They developed a simple plan. The compound would be loaded into the environmental system near the conference room, where Director Park was scheduled to meet with Commander Dravik the next morning. The fine mist would be invisible and odorless to humans, but would quickly affect any Grudians present. That night, Minji could barely sleep. Her future, perhaps her very life, depended on the success of tomorrow's plan. As she stared at the ceiling of her small quarters, a soft chime indicated someone at her door. "It's me," Tahoe's voice came through the comm system. When she opened the door, he stood there looking troubled. "There's been a change of plans. Dravik is demanding to meet tonight. He's threatening to leave with you by force if Director Park doesn't agree." Minji's heart raced. "When?" "1 hour. Conference room 2. Tahoe held up a small device. I've modified this air sampler to disperse your compound instead. We need to get it in place before the meeting." They moved quickly through the quieter night cycle corridors of the station. As they approached Conference Room 2, they spotted 2 Grudian guards standing outside. "We can't get past them," Minji whispered. Tahoe thought for a moment. "The ventilation access. There's a maintenance panel in the corridor around the corner." They backtracked and found the panel. Tahoe quickly removed it, revealing a narrow shaft. "I can't fit, but you might." Minji nodded and took the modified device. The shaft was uncomfortable, but her slender Ezrethi frame allowed her to move through it. She followed Tahoe's directions, counting junction points until she reached the vent above Conference Room 2. Through the grate, she could see Director Park already seated at the table. Commander Dravik entered, followed by 2 more Grudian officers. Their scaled skin gleamed under the bright lights. "Let's dispense with pleasantries," Dravik said, his gravelly voice echoing in the room. "Your stalling tactics have grown tiresome, Director." "We're following proper diplomatic protocols," Director Park replied calmly. "Earth Central." "Earth Central doesn't concern me," Dravik interrupted. "The Ezrathi female possesses knowledge vital to Grudian security. Her biological expertise is property of the Empire." Director Park remained composed. "Minji is a recognized resident of Terra Station. We don't acknowledge sentient beings as property." "Then perhaps you'll acknowledge this," Dravik said, placing a datapad on the table. "Orders from my government declaring that withholding her constitutes an act of espionage under Section 17 of our treaty." Minji's fingers trembled as she positioned the device near the vent. One press of the button would release the compound into the room below. "Your government has been informed of our concerns regarding your bioweapons program," Director Park said, surprising both Minji and Dravik. "We have evidence that you're seeking to develop biological agents for warfare in violation of galactic accords." Dravik's yellow eyes narrowed. "What evidence?" "The very reason you want Minji," Director Park replied. "Your sudden interest in an Ezrathi you previously abandoned as useless coincides with your new assignment to Sector 7, where we know you're establishing a biological research facility." Minji pressed the button. The device made no sound as it released a fine mist through the vent. Below, Dravik leaned forward aggressively. "You're making dangerous accusations based on speculation." "Am I?" Director Park remained calm, watching as the commander's movements became slightly stiff. "Our intelligence suggests." She stopped as Dravik suddenly grabbed at his throat, his breathing becoming labored. The other Grudian officers showed similar symptoms, their movements growing sluggish. "What is happening?" Dravik gasped, trying to stand but finding his legs unresponsive. Director Park stood quickly, backing away from the table. "Medical emergency in Conference Room 2. She called into her communicator. Within minutes, the Grudians were secured by station security. Minji had made her way back through the ventilation system to where Tahoe waited anxiously. "It worked," she told him. "They couldn't move." Tahoe hugged her impulsively. "We need to get to Director Park." In the aftermath, the Grudians were confined to their ship under guard. Director Park met with Minji and Tahoe in her office, her expression both serious and impressed. "That was extremely risky," she told them, "but effective. The Grudians are furious, of course, but in a difficult position." "What happens now?" Minji asked. "Earth Central has been provided with evidence of their bioweapon program," Director Park explained. "The paralytic compound you created proves your biological knowledge could be weaponized, which confirms our suspicions about their intentions." She smiled slightly. "The diplomatic channels are buzzing. The Galactic Council has been notified, and the Grudian Empire is facing serious questions about treaty violations." 3 weeks later, Minji stood in the newly expanded hydroponics bay. Under her guidance, food production had increased so dramatically that Terra Station had begun exporting fresh produce to neighboring outposts. Her official title was now Sen, a botanical specialist, with a salary and quarters befitting her expertise. Commander Dravik and his ship had long since departed, but not before the Galactic Council had imposed sanctions on the Grudian Empire for their bioweapon research. More significantly, the Council had recognized the Azrathi as a protected species, making their enslavement illegal in all Council territories. Tahoe entered the hydroponics bay, smiling as he saw Minji teaching 2 human apprentices about plant compatibility. Her confidence had grown remarkably in the months since her rescue from the maintenance tunnels. "I have news," he said when she finished her lesson. "Earth Central has approved our proposal. We're getting funding for the refugee integration program." Minji's blue face lit up with joy. "Really? They approved it all?" "Everything," Tahoe confirmed. "Housing, education, job placement. Any former slaves who reach human territory will have a path to residency and a new life." Minji looked out over the thriving plants she had nurtured. From a discarded slave hiding in darkness, she had become someone who could now help others find their way to freedom and purpose. "Commander Dravik thought I was useless," she said quietly. "He never understood that value isn't measured by what you can take from someone, but by what they can create and give to others." She touched a flowering plant, its delicate petals unfurling toward the artificial light. "Sometimes the things that make us different are exactly what make us valuable." Tahoe nodded, looking at the transformed hydroponics bay. "You've created something beautiful here." "This is just the beginning," Minji replied, her eyes bright with plans for the future. "There are so many others who need to find their place, just as I found mine." As she spoke, a message appeared on the main station announcement system. "Attention all personnel. Transport vessel arriving from Grudian border territories. Refugee processing teams report to Docking Bay 4. Minji and Tahoe exchanged a glance of understanding. Their work was just beginning. "Shall we go welcome them?" Tahoe asked. Minji nodded, her slight limp barely noticeable as she moved toward the door with purpose. "Yes, let's show them what freedom looks like."